George Orwell hated totalitarianism. There's no doubting that his books, essays, and papers were declarations of war against any system that suppressed individual freedom. But here's the paradox. For someone so obsessed with denouncing power, Orwell understood power all too well, perhaps even better than those who wielded it. His sharp critiques of governments, corporations, and dominant ideologies came not from a naive idealism, but from someone who had seen the workings from the inside. He didn't write as a mere armchair intellectual. Orwell had been there, had felt it firsthand, and that's why his insight was so cutting. But this also put him in an uncomfortable position. How do you fight an enemy without using the same weapons as them? How can you challenge power without, in a way, trying to construct a new control over the story? To understand this paradox, we need to look at his life. Orwell was not a theoretician out of touch with reality. He lived the extreme of power firsthand. His experience in the Spanish Civil War was a turning point. He had previously believed that fighting fascism was a matter of good versus evil, but when he arrived in Spain, he found something he had not expected. The revolutionaries themselves, those who claimed to be fighting for freedom, were just as prone to censorship and brutality as their enemies. He witnessed purges, betrayals, and summary executions within the anti-fascist ranks, and it left a lasting impression on him. Orwell realized that the problem was not just who is in power, but the dynamics of power itself. Every ideology, when it becomes absolute, tends to crush those who dissent. This made him realize a disturbing dilemma if even movements that promise freedom end up becoming oppressive. Where is the way out? This insight was reinforced during his time at the BBC, where he worked producing propaganda for the British government. During the Second World War, the young Orwell, who despised media manipulation, was now part of the machine. He was on the other side, helping to construct narratives that guided public perception, and what he realized was terrifying. Truth was often not a question of facts, but of who had the loudest voice. War was fought not just with weapons, but with words, with speeches, with the way events were described or suppressed. When he left the BBC, Orwell carried a dark certainty: freedom of thought will always be under attack no matter where power comes from. And it was from this mixture of disillusionment and lucidity that 1984 was born. When people talk about this book, they usually see it as an indictment of obvious totalitarian regimes, a kind of prophecy against future dictatorships. But Orwell was more sophisticated than that. He wasn't just warning about an oppressive government spying on its citizens. He was showing something much more dangerous: how people learn to love their own oppression, how fear, repetition, and conformity make the person defend the system that imprisons him. Orwell's genius was to grasp that control need not be imposed exclusively by violence. Sometimes all it takes is the right story. This leads to a fascinating contradiction. If Orwell understood the manipulation of power so well, and if he himself used language as a weapon, to what extent was he not also shaping a specific vision of the world? When he denounced manipulation, he was also creating his own narrative. A narrative that, because it was so powerful, has come to influence entire generations, which brings us to an essential question. If truth can be controlled, who controls Orwell? This question becomes even more intriguing when we consider how his works have been appropriated over time. During the Cold War, 1984 was widely used as a propaganda tool by Western governments against the Soviet Union. Orwell's message, which was a warning against all types of totalitarianism, was simplified to serve a specific side. His name was transformed into a symbol of the fight against communism, ignoring the fact that he was also criticizing corporate capitalism and the manipulation of the media. In Western democracies, Orwell tried to expose the systems of power, but he ended up being used by them. And here is the final irony. Orwell believed that a free society needed critical individuals capable of questioning the dominant narratives. But what if critical thinking itself becomes a new form of control? If the same tools we use to question authority are used to reinforce a new orthodoxy? It is precisely this trap that we will explore in the next chapter, because if truth can be manipulated, then even rebellion can be transformed into an illusion. Orwell taught us that truth can be manipulated. But here's the problem. Even this training can be used as a weapon of control. 1984. An animal farm were written as warnings, but they became guides not just for those who want to resist power, but also for those who want to wield it. This is the ultimate paradox, or well-denounced manipulation. But in doing so, he created a new form of influence. He exposed the tactics of totalitarianism. And in doing so, he gave future generations a kind of manual, a detailed roadmap for how mind control and reality. Engineering work, the concept of double thought, for example, is one of the most unsettling IDE as Orwell introduced to us in 1984. The party not only lies through its teeth but teaches people to embrace two contradictory truths. At the same time, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But here's the question. Is this just a dystopian creation, or is it already happening in the real world? When governments talk about humanitarian interventions that paradoxically lead to war, when corporations champion transparency while secretly manipulating data, or when ideologies preach tolerance yet aggressively censor dissenting opinions, we find ourselves confronting exactly what Orwell described. And the most unsettling part? Many of these methods are adopted by those who profess to be inspired by him. Orwell's admonition against manipulating the facts has, strangely, become a tool of manipulation itself. What was once a demand for critical thinking has transformed into an excuse for promoting one's own narrative. The paradox is clear. Orwell's name is cited by people attempting to expose dishonesty. Yet in doing so, they often partake in the very distortion of reality he advised against. Take any modern political dispute, and you'll discover something curious. All sides use Orwell to defend their points. Leaders on the right and the left, libertarians and authoritarians, activists, media critics, and mainstream journalists alike, they all mention Orwell as support of their beliefs. But how can this be? How can one thinker be claimed by factions that stand in full ideological contradiction to one other? The answer is easy. Orwell has become a blank canvas onto which each party puts its own vision of reality. The term Orwellian, which originally alluded to a totalitarian society that distorts truth and regulates ideas, has now been bandied around so loosely that it has lost much of its original meaning. And this, in turn, is perhaps the most Orwellian development of all. Another fundamental point arises. Orwell advised people to challenge official narratives, but what happens when questioning itself develops into a new sort of orthodoxy? In today's society, rebellion has become a hugely successful industry. Being against the system no longer makes one an outsider. In fact, it has become a well-oiled business model. Books, seminars, influencers, entire political parties rely on selling the impression that they alone possess the secret truth, that they alone can see through the system's deception. And here's the catch. This dynamic isn't so different from the structures they claim to fight. The alternative narratives that portray themselves as autonomous and rebellious typically follow the same script as the mainstream forces they criticize, dominating discourse, stifling opposition, and profiting from conflict. Instead of liberating minds, they perpetuate ideological bubbles, replacing one type of dogma with another. The very people who profess to be uncovering manipulation frequently construct their own version of it, leading to a loop where the quest of truth is perpetually hindered by opposing agendas. This takes us to a deeper philosophical dilemma. Is true freedom possible when every perspective is tinted by hidden interests? If every exhortation to wake up is really a marketing ploy, how can we separate genuine awareness from another layer of manipulation? If every movement claims to be the resistance, then who is actually in control? The essence of Orwell's warning wasn't just about government excess or media control. It was about the vulnerability of truth itself in a world where words and perception may be weaponized. Once words lose their meaning, once argument becomes just another tool of ideological warfare, reality itself becomes a battleground. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a world where doublethink isn't just a dystopian concept. It's an everyday reality, where people hold contradictory beliefs without noticing the discrepancy, where skepticism is encouraged only when it suits a particular narrative, and where truth is not something we uncover but something we construct. Orwell warned us of a future where language would be distorted, where control would be exerted by the subtle rewriting of history, and where the very act of questioning could be co-opted into the machinery of control. The scariest part is that we are not approaching that reality. We are already living in it. The question is, are we even aware? George Orwell's indictment of tyranny in 1984 was so striking because it showed a scary reality, the possibility of a system to impose a single, irrefutable version of the truth. But what if control no longer relies on imposing just one reality? What if, instead, it flourishes by overwhelming people with an overflow of contradicting narratives? What if the modern world does not strive to prescribe absolute truth, but rather to drown individuals in so many conflicting versions that they lose their ability to recognize reality at all? In such a setting, truth does not only get distorted, it evaporates totally. When people are assaulted with unending streams of contradictory information, their skepticism no longer works as a screen against manipulation. Rather, it becomes the very mechanism via which they can be manipulated. If nothing is trustworthy, then anything can be accepted. If every opinion is equally valid, then nothing possesses intrinsic value. This is where Orwell's warning takes on a new, more terrible meaning. He did not merely teach us to question authority. He also illustrated that the act of questioning itself might be weaponized. The act of fighting control, in many situations, becomes just another cog in the machine of manipulation. Today, we live in an era where information is not just twisted, but pulverized into a million bits. Traditional rebellion, which was formerly considered as an act of defiance, sometimes becomes a pre-scripted function within the broader system. Movements that purport to challenge authority can, ironically, end up supporting the very systems they condemn. The system does not always quiet opposition, sometimes it absorbs and repurposes it. This leads us to an alarming question. What was Orwell's genuine intention? Did he offer us methods to escape manipulation, or did he simply lay naked the inescapability of it? And more crucially, if his work has been utilized both to reveal and to obfuscate the nature of control, then what does his legacy really represent? If Orwell were living today, would he recognize himself in the readings of his own work? Or would he be appalled to see his ideas utilized in the very manner he feared most, as a means of control rather than liberation? This is where we confront the biggest irony. Orwell warned us about the pitfalls of groupthink, yet even his most fervent admirers can fall into the same trap. His appeal for independent thought has, in many cases, transformed into inflexible dogma, rules on how to think correctly rather than an invitation to think freely. And therefore, we must ask, did Orwell actually fight for the unfiltered freedom of thought? Or did he, consciously or unconsciously, promote a specific acceptable version of it? The uncomfortable truth is that no one, not even Orwell himself, could totally avoid the mechanics of power. He exposed the processes of control, while he too was involved in them. Orwell vehemently opposed dictatorial regimes, although he also believed that certain ideas needed to be forcefully resisted. He championed freedom of speech, but he did not hesitate to openly criticize academics whom he saw as harmful. One of his final acts before his death remains particularly controversial. He handed over a list of writers and public people who, according to him, had pro-Soviet tendencies. For some, this was an act of consistency. a final warning against the ideological dangers of communist invading British society. For others, it was an act of betrayal, an Orwellian contradiction that replicated the very systems of repression and control he had decried. How does one reconcile this contradiction? Perhaps Orwell was not presenting us a clean-cut blueprint for freedom, but rather a cruel truth, that power games are unavoidable, and that even the strongest opponent of dictatorship can become enmeshed in its web. His legacy, then, is not a collection of answers but a set of provocations, a warning that no philosophy, no thinker, no movement is immune to the very forces it aims to expose. If Orwell's writing teaches us anything, it is that vigilance must be exerted not only overtly but inside. The true risk is not just outward tyranny but the subtle, creeping ways in which even the most well-intentioned movements and individuals can become part of the machinery of control. The ultimate irony of 1984 is that the battle against manipulation itself can become a controlled act. So, if we reflect on Orwell's observations, perhaps the true question is not whether we can escape control, but whether we can ever properly realize when we are being controlled at all. Blacklist. This is the essence of the Orwellian dilemma. Even the fiercest enemies of oppression can, at times, act in an oppressive manner. This paradox is firmly integrated into the way Orwell is viewed today. His ideas, which were originally a clear denunciation of tyranny, have paradoxically been stolen to support conflicting purposes. Where formerly they were a rallying cry against authoritarian power, nowadays they are utilized both as instruments of resistance and as justifications for authority. Governments quote Orwell to attack their rivals while also adopting measures that he would very probably have disapproved. The irony is clear. Political groups, too, steal his concepts, employing them as weapons to condemn the ideological rigidity of others, often without realizing that, in doing so, they impose their own strict ideological framework. The entire idea of Orwell has become a symbol, a badge of validity. If an argument has his signature, it is immediately accorded extra legitimacy, regardless of its real quality. But isn't this precisely the kind of symbolic manipulation that Jesus cautioned us against? This takes us to a fundamental question. Did Orwell provide us answers, or did he simply expose that all answers inevitably lead back to the same dilemma? Perhaps his true legacy rests not in 1984 or Animal Farm, but in the seeds of doubt he planted, the discomfort of realizing that freedom is never total, and that every act of resistance bears within itself the potential to become the very thing it resists. Orwell did not offer us a safe way out of power systems. Rather, he showed the inevitable truth that power is omnipresent, even inside the ideologies that aim to demolish it. His works do not only describe the risks of authoritarian regimes, they serve as an unpleasant reminder that power exists in various forms: overt, hidden, systemic, ideological. This is what makes his contradiction so enduring, and thus we are left with a final, disturbing question. After everything Orwell revealed to us, are we still truly free to think for ourselves, or are we only picking which pre-constructed story to subscribe to? In a world where knowledge is abundant, yet controlled by unseen hands, where every resistance movement risks turning into a new kind of control, can we ever be assured that our thoughts are our own? Be honest. Have you ever thought that no matter how hard you try, no one truly sees you? It's not about lacking worth. It's about understanding how to make that value visible. The social game is not fair. If you don't know the rules, you get left behind.